thank you everyone for joining us today for today's LinkedIn Live event, COP26, What Next for Business and Boards. We've been overwhelmed by the response today with an event which only launched last week, having received around 1,600 registrations. This question of climate change and the role of the board in governing for it is a question that's front of mind for directors across the country. With that in mind, the AICD launched the Climate Governance Initiative Australia in August, which will make us part of a global network of directors across the nation and across the globe focused on lifting their own board's climate competency and skills. We're pleased to be holding today's event with that initiative support. Before we get formally started, I'd like to acknowledge that this broadcast is taking place in Sydney, here on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. A special welcome to any First Nations people who have joined us here today. A few quick technical aspects to cover before we jump into today's discussion. This broadcast is taking place via the LinkedIn platform. This is the first time we've used it, so we're hoping it'll be a big success. If we have any technical difficulties, please note that you can jump onto the Vimeo link, which is also available on the LinkedIn Live event webpage. So there are two webcasts taking place simultaneously. So if there's any issues you think at our end or at your own end, please jump onto the Vimeo one. There's also a Twitter and LinkedIn handle for this event, which is COP26 AICD. We strongly encourage audience participation and look forward to answering as many questions as we can during the time we've got allotted. For those AICD members wishing to count today's event to their Director of Professional Development, you'll need to manually log that in our AICD member web profile. So I'm delighted to have with me today two leading climate governance experts. On my immediate left, I've got Sam Mostyn AO. She's a leading non-executive director and sustainability advisor. She's the chair of Citibank Australia, president of Chief Executive Women, a board member of Mirvac, Transurban, the Climate Council and the Centre for Policy Development. She's very much seen by the AICD and throughout the director community as a leading voice on effective climate governance. And then to my far left, I have Zoe Whitton, the executive director of Pollination, a climate change advisory firm. She's also on the board of the Investor Group on Climate Change and a member of the Climate Governance Initiative Working Group here in Australia. So thank you everyone for making time for us. Really just want to quickly just jump to what you would see as the headline and why you think this conversation is so important at this time. Sam?
Well, Chris, I think the very reason that the AICD has hosted this event so close to the very end of COP26 tells us that this issue has become front of mind for everyone interested in the future of our economies, of our countries, and there's been no greater example of that than the change in the kinds of things being discussed at COP. We're no longer talking about science and the validation of science. We're accepting the IPCC reports, and where Glasgow really took us, and I'm sure Zoe will fill us in more, is the speed of change required and these massive transitions that are going on, including the transition of capital and the role of companies and the rising role of ESG, the environmental, social and governance principles that most directors now face. Big things happened at COP, and even the former Bank of England Governor, Mark Carney, turning up with about $130 trillion worth of commitments from private financing for climate tells us that this was a big moment where everyone was stepping up to say that this is a moment to act. And of course, it was against a backdrop of all the proof of climate change impacts all around the world. And we saw some fascinating new geopolitical alignments that came of COP. And for Australia, of course, before we hit the terrible time of COVID, we came out of the most severe bushfires the country had experienced. So this has been front of mind, I guess, as a lived part of our community. It's now become real for us, particularly those of us involved in governance of companies.
Thanks very much, Sam. So I might give a little bit of background, I think, to why the AICD is hosting today's event. So the AICD has a membership of 46,000 across not-for-profits, listed, private and government enterprise. And over the last 18 months, I really think there's been a step change in how boards have approached these issues. It's gone from being a niche issue for certain climate-exposed sectors to really being a mainstream topic in many boardrooms across the nation. And I think that's a really important step forward. We recently did an Australian first survey of directors' attitudes and approaches to climate change earlier this year, and we'll be releasing the results of that survey at the end of this month. And we had some really interesting results. I'll share a few of them here today, and then, as I said, We will publish at the end of November, and there'll be a webinar on the 9th of December to go through it in more detail. So some of the telling statistics that came out of that survey was that almost half of directors want their boards to increase their attention on climate change. Interestingly, just under half want to do more but don't know where to start, and that's really something we hear very frequently. There's a lot of goodwill, a lot of intention, but how do you start? And that's particularly relevant, I think, to not-for-profits who often feel resource constrained and are dealing often with issues of financial viability, particularly coming on the back of COVID, and who'll have good intentions but struggling to see how they can really get started on that climate journey. Directors cite policy uncertainty as a key inhibitor to effective climate governance as well, and then that challenge of the short-term focus. They're so fixated on dealing with short-term issues that these long, complex, multifactorial risks and opportunities which climate change presents is something that is difficult to grapple with. We know that directors want to do more in this space, but we know that there's limited education. And so that's why we've launched the Climate Governance Initiative here in Australia in August. That launch event, we had 3,000 people register. We had 1,500 attend live. And, we recently launched a climate risk guide with Minter Ellison. That's already had 3,000 downloads in only a couple of months. So there's huge appetite. And I think our role is to, tap into experts like yourselves and really help directors to upskill. And knowing, there are some for which this issue will be a passionate cause for them, and there'll be others who, looking at it in a very clear-headed, cool-minded way and see it as something which is core part their job, core part of their responsibilities, the responsibility of stakeholders, investors, employees, and the community. So we should bear that in mind. I should say as well, we're going to have questions from the audience today. Please send them through. Very keen to answer as many as we can, and we look forward to the discussion. So, Zoe, I might turn to you now and say, obviously climate change is not new. We've been talking about climate change for decades, but it feels like it's reached a tipping point in this last maybe 9 to 10 months. What's your take on what's accelerating change?
It's a really good question. So, I think Sam was saying we're just coming through this moment with COP26 where the global community, but also particularly the global commercial community, is coming to a point where it's starting to countenance the entirety of this transition, not just the energy transition, which we talk about a lot, but also the climate change itself and the implications of climate change itself. And there is this great sort of stand-up in ambition and this really big emphasis on the commercial side of this conversation. And one of the things that we get asked a lot over and over again is it a fad? As you guys know, I've been doing ESG for quite a while, and the number of times, if I had $1 for the number of times someone said, so, when are we going to stop doing ESG, as a sort of leading question, I wouldn't have a fortune, but I'd certainly probably have another handbag. And people say the same thing about climate change. So, we've been doing so much on it isn't going to turn around. And then at the same time, people often say to us, we really missed renewables. We're sort of trying to figure out what the next thing is. And those two things are the same end, are two ends of the same issue, which is that people often conceive this as cyclical, but it's actually structural. Mm-hmm. So we're seeing this structural change, and we really are at the beginning of what has to be an S-curve. And people see all the noise and the movement and the activity that's happening at the moment and feel quite overwhelmed by it, particularly those of us in the industry who often don't have enough time to get sleep. But we really are just at the beginning of that transition that we need to make as we go through this process. And so it's going to touch more and more people. It's going to become more and more relevant for directors, and it's going to become more and more commercial. So that's sort of where we stand. And that's why this is a trend change rather than a blip of activity that's sort of going to fade afterwards.
Great. Thank you, Zoe. So obviously there's COP26, international conferences and agreements are full of acronyms. What is this major climate change conference? What's actually happening at it? What outcomes are there? Is it all just talk, or is there actually something material which boards and directors need to be focused on?
Cool. Well, so let me talk about the conference itself first for a moment, because I know sometimes we say COP26 in Glasgow and we throw all these words around, and I think a lot of people are sort of sitting there going, what is COP26? So a conference of the parties is a yearly meeting that all of the parties to the United Nations, the governments, go to, and they negotiate climate change agreements. And many of you will be, some of these COPs are more important than others. Many of you will remember the Paris Agreement that was negotiated at a COP in Paris. And so some of these COPs are more important than others. Glasgow is one of those COPs. So Glasgow, the purpose of Glasgow, which is happening in Glasgow, it's COP26, is to basically bed down the Paris Agreement. So we have the Paris Agreement, it's this overarching thing. And at Glasgow, we're trying to say, let's make this real. You know, what's the roadmap that we're going to use to actually get there? What are the commitments that we need to make this something that's actually material? So that's when people talk about COP26, that's COP26. Now, there have been agreements on lots of topics. So I won't go through every single one because we'll be here for 25 years. But not everyone agrees. So, you know, every time an agreement is announced, you'll hear, you know, these countries are in and these countries are out. And that probably all sounds a little bit like everyone's going everywhere. But what COP is useful for is as a weather vane. So we go into COP, we sort of see the emphasis, we see the movement, we see the momentum, and it tells us where the whole system is going. And what we can tell from this COP at the moment is that the level of ambition in the system is really picking up, right? So let me talk about a few of the sort of takeaways from COP rather than necessarily walking you through all of the various agreements that have happened. I think where it becomes relevant for Australian companies and directors is probably across 4 points. So the first is that there really has been a strengthening of ambition, including among our export markets. So we're seeing a lot of things out of COP. We're seeing an increased demand for countries to come back and increase their 2030 targets over time, to do that more rapidly, so that timeline is shortening. We are seeing increased pressure on coal and also on fossil fuel subsidies. So that's starting to show up all the way through the negotiations and the texts and the agreements. We are seeing an increased amount of ambition from emerging markets. So we've seen this incredible commitment from India to have half of their energy from renewable sources by 2030. That's not far away. We've also seen an agreement in the last few days between China and the US to work on accelerating this in the next 10 years. And all of that is telling us that, A, yes, we're seeing the actual bones, the real infrastructure of Paris starting to happen, but B, we're particularly starting to see it happening in emerging markets. And that happens to be a lot of the places that we tend to sell our things. So it's really, really important for us here in Australia. And they are really stepping up to the plate. The second point is that we're getting closer to a deal on carbon markets. Now, you might ask, why is that relevant, carbon markets? And the reason it's relevant is because as we go through this transition, one of the things that most previous Australian policies relied on was that there would be this big pool of carbon offsets available globally. And what they're trying to decide is how big that pool is and how liquid it will be. So it's about supply. And so we're getting closer to an agreement on supply. The third point I want to make, to pull out what Sam said earlier, is that capital is getting much more ambitious. So many of us face into capital markets, and we probably have spent the last 5 years going, gosh, capital markets are getting very interested. But as Sam noted, there have been a number of commitments at COP that mean that capital market participants are going to get more and more ambitious and probably more and more prescriptive with respect to the asks and the requirements that they have of major companies, including in Australia. And the final point I just want to make is that resilience is really coming up on the agenda. Now, you might say, what does resilience mean? Resilience means protecting ourselves from actual climate change. How do we make our roads, how do we make our infrastructure, how do we make our homes safe when we have to live through climate change? Sam mentioned the bushfires that we lived through a couple of years ago. We are starting to face into that. And for Australian companies, that means that the question will start to be, are you resilient? You know, how can you demonstrate your resilience to me? So that's just a few very high-level points. Sam, do you want to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say, because you've given us an incredible sweep of what's happened in the last 2 weeks at COP. There were a couple of things I thought that jumped out that maybe our audience would like to know about. And one is that, as you described, the Paris Agreement happened at a COP after a failure at Copenhagen. So there's been Copenhagen, Paris, and probably Glasgow are the big COPs that really define what's been happening in this space. And every time we've met since Paris, there has been an obligation on those parties, those countries that have signed the Paris Agreement, to ratchet up their commitments that were made at Paris. And so Australia had to take something to Glasgow because each of the parties were being asked at this COP, at this one in Glasgow, to say, what are your ratcheting up commitments you'll make whether it's net zero or in industry sectors. And that's why you saw Australia having to really work fast to get a 2050 target, because that's a requirement of the COP. So many other countries were ratcheting up, and they'll ratchet up again next year and the year after, and we'll see that, I think, moving very, very quickly and more exponentially. So it's a big part of why country and why all of the national leaders were in town for the start of it to make their new targets. The second thing, as I say, it goes to your point about what was going on. So every day there was another set of issues being dealt with. A couple of big things that really mattered to directors is there were big commitments made on things like methane. So many countries made big commitments to a big, massive reduction in methane as a greenhouse gas. There was a big focus on rainforests and nature and natural capital. So within the course of the 2 weeks, many nation states, many subgroups within the COP parties actually committed to some pretty big changes, and we have to be very attuned to that in this country. We may not have been a party to all of them as Australia, but for directors online who are with companies that have global supply chains or are dealing into the markets where those commitments were made, this becomes very important for us to know where those commitments sit and what that means for Australian businesses and directors.
Thanks, Zoe. Thanks, Sam. So, one of the key, messages coming out of COP from where I sit is there's been a real push by the UK to take a leadership position and really to rally other countries towards more ambitious targets. Standing on the verge of the end of COP, it sounds like we're not on that trajectory for a 1.5 degree warming. What does that mean for a director sitting in Australia? Because it does seem like something which is, very far away.
It means that there's more to come, right? You're going back to this point of if you've lived through the last 5 years as a director and you're thinking, my God, I'm having to ask a lot of questions, having to answer a lot of questions about this, it's all getting very intense. When you get to the end of COP and we can say in one breath, we've seen this incredible step up in ambition and there's still a huge way to go, it tells you that there's a huge scale up in activity that is coming in this space. And I think what's happened at COP, to touch on, the points that we've made throughout, is we've really gone from ambition to roadmap. But as you get into the roadmap territory, you start to have to face the question of, how are you going to implement those targets and are they actually going to get there? Now, the UN published a report during COP that said where presently our sort of trajectory is something like 2.7 degrees. If you'd told a little me at COP15, more than 10 years ago that was our trajectory, I would have been exasperated and also overjoyed because we were once upon a time going for 4. So that's a great outcome. But then the IEA have come out and said, if we actually implement all these commitments, we might get to 1.8. But we know from what the IPCC has told us, which is the UN's major scientific body on climate change, that we need to get to 1.5 to be safe. Even the types of spaces we're in at the moment are spaces where we lose the reef, lose a lot of tourism in Queensland. There's still really, really difficult, dangerous space that we're in. So there's a lot of action yet to go. Sam?
Well, I was going to say, we've sort of alighted on the issues for directors and the commercial issues, but we haven't kind of, said clearly what does a 1.8 or 1.9 world look like? And we've agreed that what's come out of COP from both the scientists and those that have delivered their commitments, that the best we can hope for is to keep ourselves just under 2 degrees. But that kind of change we're talking about is something that's lived and felt all around the world in very different ways, whether it's temperature, extreme events, flooding, more cyclones, more typhoons. And it's the reason why the Prime Minister of Samoa delivered his address standing in a rising sea in his nation to say, this is a very real and present danger. So this is now a climate risk that has become not just financial, but it's a human risk. And I think many of the people in the parties to the Glasgow discussions, and those of us looking from here would say, and that's why you had so many protesters turn up, so many movements that were at Glasgow to say, this is about our, how we will live and how our children will live. And I thought it was fascinating. I'm a Republican. I want to see Australia a republic, so I didn't expect to be quoting Her Royal Highness, Her Royal Majesty, the Queen. But she commented in her opening address that what was sought of country leaders was not politics and government for today. It was statesmanship for the future. And I think if we think about what that means for directors and boards and companies, we have to be stewards of something rather than just managing for today. And there is no doubt from the science that we now understand as to where this is heading. And that urgency, this decade, matters more than it has than any other probably shorter period than we've seen if we trust the climate science.
Thank you, Sam. Look, so I'm keen to bring in some of the audience questions, and we have one from Neil, who's asked, what advice do you have for directors who want to support targets but are worried about being seen to take political sides?
I might jump in there. And Neil, thank you. I did bring a whole lot of material today in anticipation of some great questions, and that's a tremendous one, Neil. There are already chief executives across Australia that are forming coalitions to actually ask those very questions. So the Climate Council, the Climate Leaders Coalition, which has, I think, 33 chief executives, if you want to read their report, they've actually got the questions that chief executives and boards must be asking, and all of the parties to that agreement and that coalition are actually leaning well into the need for there to be climate targets. And I don't think they think of themselves as political. I think they think of themselves as representing the interests of their organisations, their communities, and they're stepping up as leaders. So you don't have to get political to ask the question as to why wouldn't we have targets for this country that protect us against the rising temperatures and the issues that would have for us. And there is so much information now available to you to draw on to show that this is a primary issue for our economy and for our society. So I think there are many, we might put up later some of the materials you can draw on, but the Climate Council has tremendous reports. Climate Works Australia has done a remarkable amount of work on how you look at industry sectors and how you ask those questions, again, not politically. And the Centre for Policy Development has done a lot of work on, again, how directors and companies can ask this question, and looking towards us being leaders and having good policy and good engagement with solutions. And of course, at the bottom of all this sits great opportunity, which I'm sure we'll talk about a bit later.
I would add to that from, having just spent probably too long inside investment banks and thinking about this from in a completely commercial perspective, I would reinforce Sam's point that you are not alone. So, if you feel like you're making a political statement here, you're making a political statement along with most of the ASX and most of the large investors. I mean, I think the amount of assets managed under the new Glasgow Financial Alliance commitments globally are $57 trillion plus. And that tells you a little bit about the scale of these commitments in the commercial sector. So you're not alone. But the second thing I would say is that one of the things that, and we've been talking about this for a while, once upon a time, you would get asked this question and you talk about climate change and people will say, oh, well, you mean climate policy, don't you? Because that's the only way that a company is going to face risk is if we have a carbon price. And, we did, and we had that experience and everyone went through it, and we used to think about carbon risk as being all about this carbon price. It's not about government policy anymore. The risk is not policy, the risk is commercial. And so, Sam's mentioned supply chains. One of the things we're starting to see is that if you're a large listed company and you've made a commitment on this and you have some really large institutional shareholders, you set a net zero commitment, it pertains to your supply chain. So what do? You go to your suppliers and you say, I need you to do this as well. And so now your customers are starting to ask you about this. It's not a political statement. It's something that's flowing up the value chain. And that's this massive shift in emphasis. It means that whether the Australian government makes policy or not, doesn't protect you from risk. It could enable your response, but it doesn't protect you from risk. And so you have to think about this as commercial.
I think what we have to, acknowledge is that often government does trail good business and the economics of change. And we've seen that with, the Commonwealth. But state governments we've got a Treasurer in New South Wales, Matt Keane, who has made net zero commitments and been quite clear about the fact that, again, it's not political. He sees that as part of the protection of the state. And I think the Commonwealth will follow because there'll be just this incredible shift that will change so dramatically in the coming years that I don't know, we have to wait for government to act. And I thought I'd just back to that question about how to do this without being political. The statement of the commitments that 33 chief executives already made just starts with something like this. We take climate change seriously in our business. We support the Paris agreements and Australia's commitment to it, including the objective to keep global warming well below 2 degrees. They finished by saying, we believe that a responsible and equitable transition to a low emissions economy is an opportunity to improve Australia's prosperity. So you can see the framing. These are big statements that are made about bringing short-term targets to 2030. That's not politics. That is good governance. These are leaders stepping up and they're joining with civil society, customers, supply chains to do that job really well.
Thank you. So I'm keen to just hone in, a little bit on the Australian government policy before getting into some of the governance aspects. I do think it is important. So, where do you think we sit in the field or in the pack? Obviously, there was an announcement around a net zero by 2050 on the pretty shortly before the Prime Minister left for Glasgow. What's your take on that and 2030 targets and some of the debate around that?
I'll start. You'll have a lot to say. I remember saying a couple of years ago, Paris is a room where the world's governments are negotiating the future and what the future is going to look like and how it's going to play out. And we have to make a decision whether or not we're in that room. We're presently not in the room. We've probably stopped pretending that the room isn't there, which is what we used to do, but we're certainly not in it, and we're definitely late to the party. And I mean, this is in some sense you can understand why this is hard for us. I was reading about Sam mentioned that there have been a lot of targets about things, a lot of different subjects at COP. One of them was electric vehicles. There was this big global commitment to phase out petrol-based cars by 2035. Germany wasn't on the list. It was a big list. Germany wasn't on the list. And someone asked Germany, the spokesperson of Germany, why? And they said, because we believe that petrol cars, highly efficient petrol cars, will play a role in transition. And I thought, isn't that familiar? I've heard that here. We say that about gas and we say that about coal-fired power. And really what both of those parties are saying is we've got a very strong thing that we presently make quite a lot of income from, and we're really, really hoping that we want it to be part of that transition pathway. And so we're not going to get involved and we're going to hold back. And that's understandable as a emotional position, but it's not safe. And so where we are at the moment is that we're on a different path, and it makes it difficult for Australian companies because a lot of people will get to opportunities. A lot of people are starting to see the opportunity here. And if you're in Europe, you are sitting in a world where there is a policy pathway that enables you to start investing in that opportunity to get things stood up. If you're an Australian company, Australian director, you're sitting in an environment where you can see those opportunities coming, the commercial risk is coming at you, but you don't have the policy support to enable you to act on those opportunities as clearly as you might otherwise like to do. It's sort of like having two F1 teams and one of them is state funded and the other one isn't, but you still want to win the race. That's kind of where we're at. Sam, you're going to have a lot more to say about this as well.
Not so much a lot more. I guess I think I'm just saddened by it because clearly this is where you get to politics because you've now got all of the lead up to what will be a federal election probably fought on climate issues. And so we're seeing bits and pieces of it, whether it's electric charging stations or money to the CEFC for some technology for carbon capture, which is all saying that there's an acknowledgement that there's the issue to deal with. But the key issue about setting a target proudly with some ambition is it's just disappointing. And the fact that business and so many other parts of the world went to Glasgow and were able to say confidently, we're leaning into an earlier target, 2030. It's going to really push us, but we're going to be there for the opportunity. And we acknowledge that if we don't, the cataclysmic issues that come with not acting fast enough really hurt us. The thing I can't work out is we are a signatory to the Sustainable Development Goals. Australia, the officials in the Foreign Service actually helped write many of those SDGs. Climate is central to that with a number of other big obligations. And that's a target set to 2030, which Australia is a signatory to, and climate sits in the middle of that. So we have signed up to pledges that have actually put us at the table theoretically, but when we need to be in the room, as Zoe has said, and to be thought of as a leading nation, we're not in those rooms at the moment. And I think we were all quite surprised, I think pleasantly, by this new relationship between the US and China on a very substantial commitment to climate change action, because they've seen through their very big geopolitical differences to actually work out how we're going to do this globally. And it's a shame that Australia is not at the table. I've loved the fact that we have been a very successful middle power, able to bring Australia's great diplomatic and great sort of ingenuity to the table in many things. And sadly, we're not on this. On the flip side, COP will meet again next year. Australia will be back. The other countries will have moved. And there's plenty of, there's now great momentum in the system, which means Australia will have to catch up. I mean, we're going to put everything else at risk and all our trade exposed industries if we don't. So I'm always an optimist, Chris, on these things. And we won't want to be at the back of the pack for very long, I think.
I would add to that the funny thing about Australia is that we have been the lucky country in a lot of things. We absolutely, I highlighted before that this is a difficult transition for us because we've got skin in the game. We've got skin in the game on both sides. We were earlier in the year, a few people published reports about the minerals exposure that Australia has, or actually the minerals need for a transition globally. And Australia is highlighted in both of those global reports as being an entity that supplies into that supply chain and has a lot of upside opportunity as a consequence. And also our renewable resources are incredible. And we have actually some really fantastic policy infrastructure already in place that we've built up over time that really could give us quite a strong footy on this and a bit of a head start. So it's not as if this is not a race that we can win, or at least be in the peloton for, but we do just have to try.
Thank you. So we've spent quite a bit of time talking about, I guess, global developments and these really large, complicated geopolitical struggles that are out there around this complex challenge of our time around climate change. I think feedback from directors is it can be quite overwhelming. So I wanted to take the conversation to a more of a local level. So if you're a director, you can see how climate change could impact your organisation. You acknowledge that you don't know much, but you're willing to learn. How do you get started? What's your advice to them, Sam?
So I think this is really the story of the Australian company director community and leading business people and lots of people more generally. So it's a really important question. And I think we've got to be generous in how we think about this, because this is a huge topic. It has risen very quickly. And I think from what I have learned of being in the director environment for a long time is sometimes in those meetings where things come up that you don't know much about, it can often feel quite inappropriate, or that you reveal something about yourself if you say, I don't know. So quite a few directors, I think, over this topic and others, kind of prefer not to admit the lack of knowledge because they feel like it might make them look like they're not a very good director. So I think the first thing is don't feel ashamed, don't feel worried about not knowing anything. What you need to worry about right now is there's no excuse not to learn. And so for all the reasons we've just discussed, this is a central topic to any organisation that is thinking about future prosperity and resilience. And so I'd say if you don't know much about climate change, get really curious, engage with all the remarkable amounts of data that's available to you, whether it's the Climate Leaders Coalition or the Climate Council issues extraordinary, impactful reports that actually tell you what the climate science is saying and then take you into all sorts of sectors. ClimateWorks Australia's website is a great place to start to look at things down industry, so you can see in your own industry what does climate mean, what do these targets mean, what is the IPCC, what is COP, everything well understood and explained. So I think this is the moment, and we know we'll come to it a bit later, directors now are carrying an imputed director's duty, a fiduciary duty, to acquit an understanding of climate risk, just as we have with financial and other risks. So there is a high bar to reach, but this is the time to really get engaged and understand the topic. But just as we've found with directors around a table who don't know much about cyber or artificial intelligence or any of the other frontiers of where our roles as governors and fiduciaries has taken us, you don't need to be perfect at it. But you do need to know that your chief executive and team are across the issue. So you've got to have the right systems and checks and balances. Someone in the room has to know enough about this to help a conversation. And so you don't need to be perfect at it, but there needs to be this conversation conducted in a pretty mature way that then ends up not just being a nice to know, but ends up in the governance structures of your boards and your companies, whether that's in the audit and risk area, whether it's a key financial risk and contained in your company statements. All of that is now it will be just normal for all of us as directors. So don't be shy about asking. Don't be frightened about saying, I don't know as much as I think I should. There are huge resources all around. And I thought I'd just mention that ClimateWorks Australia has put out that best corporate practice is pretty simple. And so if you were looking for something to say, what would I need to raise at my board to see if we're keeping up to date with this, there are 4 key ideas that ClimateWorks has said and shows through the best performing companies. And the first is just asking yourselves, do you have a long-term net zero commitment for on or before 2050? If that's not being discussed around your board tables, you probably should ask why. Why are we not in that discussion? There should be at least one medium-term target that's appropriate and ambitious, and it'll be relevant to the industry or the business that you're in. Looking very deeply at how this affects your operational issues, but particularly the value chain. What are your customers saying about their expectations of you as a company to be dealing with this issue? And just how many emissions do you have? So there's been a couple of questions about whether you just become climate neutral or carbon neutral. It's not as easy as just saying we will be climate neutral. There needs to be a commitment to how to get there. And the last thing is that all boards should now have demonstrable, tangible, near-term actions that get us onto that pathway, that say we understand where our business sits relative to the risk. We'll talk a bit later about what regulators think about this, but there is certainly a duty on all of us as directors to learn, to understand, to question. And there's so much to read and so much stuff that you can talk to your own companies about what you're doing, and it builds fantastic conversations inside the organisation.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, and I mean a little biased here, but there are so many people out there to support that expertise build. I mean, the IGCC will publish a report on climate change and boards in a few days' time, and one of the key findings is that the capability build is really the piece that's missing. And Sam, to your point, you can't afford to be. You can afford not to know. It's okay, but you can't afford to be fragile about not knowing. To go back to the earlier point, if you look at the trajectory of this change, it is going to get more and more complex, more and more all-encompassing, more and more commercial over time. And so if you're feeling a little uncomfortable now's the time to jump in. You know, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time to plant a tree is today. So, you know, pick that curiosity up, lean into it, and there are a lot of people around to support you. You could drown yourself in literature on this topic.
Yeah. I've been part of the faculty for the Cambridge University Program for Business and Sustainable Leadership, and the rise in directors joining has been remarkable over recent years. It's often been a course really for managers and for leaders of organisations, the CEO, but the program now really encompasses the role of the director. And I've seen just huge numbers, vast numbers of directors saying, actually, this will make my job far more interesting. I want to engage with it. This is one of the big social, environmental, governance issues of our times. And so it's not easy, but there are plenty of great conversations to have. And as I said, and we can talk a bit about it, but it's now, you know, if you're making statements to the market, there are people watching APRA, ASIC, the TCFD requirements, all those things that actually hold, say, you're now making a statement about effectively financial risk, because climate risk is financial risk. And that's come on very quickly in the last 5 years as a key duty. And so getting up to speed and knowing how the organisation is managing that is a duty, I think, of all directors.
Thanks, Sam. We've talked quite a lot, and I think the discussion in Australia has often been dominated about risk and about legal liability and about litigation. And what I've noticed in probably the last 12 months or so is a shift in mindset towards more, well, there's risks and we need to understand and manage those risks, but there's got to be opportunity on the other side. And that was a pretty clear theme of our member survey, which I mentioned, of around 2,000 members, where many identified there could be opportunity. So if you're sitting around a board table and you feel like the board is still fixated in a negative risk-based mindset, how do you try to turn the conversation, Sam? How do you try to get them open-minded and thinking about the opportunity too?
Well, Chris, this is probably the best place to start with the climate discussion, is because it's opportunity rich. You know, and to actually not be part of it is denying any organisation the chance to enter into these wonderful new fields of opportunity. I think the conversation needs to start with, you know, how effectively are we understanding and working with our supply chains, and can we do more? Can we do better? I've seen that around the board at, say, Mirvac, where we've looked at as a big construction company doing a huge amount of work in designing cities and thinking about how we're going to live, actually opening up the supply chain to say, could we actually do things cheaper? Could we actually deal with water, with energy, with landfill in a way that would meet bigger carbon requirements, but actually make us a better developer and make our products better for customers, and say something to our own employees about what we stand for. So I think the opportunity set sits in so many parts of good business, because everyone is now watching and waiting to see where leadership is coming from. So I think opportunity to really build deep engagement with your own people and your own organisation, because we know at the public level, this topic is really important for people to think about the future of their kids, the future of the companies they want to work for, and where they want to invest. And we know that superannuation companies ask these questions of large organisations to check whether we understand that long-term commitment and the promises we're making to big investors. So there's opportunities to open up better discussions with investors, better discussions with suppliers, with partners, product development, and cheaper forms of capital. And this, you might want to talk about the capital side of this, Zoe, but there's so much opportunity in embracing this future, and holding back and not doing it takes you back to the risk space. If you're just in the mindset of we're managing risk, it's a bit like every other new thing that's brought to directors. Safety used to be just a risk, but we embedded actually building safe workplaces as a way of actually positively impacting how our work can be done better and how we don't hurt people. The same with gender equality. The same with slavery, modern slavery. All of these things, if you do them well, are rich in opportunity. But it does require directors to step up in that conversation, I think.
And so what have you been seeing in terms of the organisations you advise?
I would say that if you're not thinking about, to add to what Sam said, if you're not thinking about opportunity, you're missing it because your competitors are. Yeah. It's the number one trend we've seen in the organisations we advise in the last 2 years. And you can see it in capital markets, particularly in private markets, is just this, it was funny. 5 years ago, we used to talk about climate change, and people would talk about it and they would get it and they'd go, yes, transition risk, and we've got it. And then things wouldn't move and you would think, I don't think you've got it, because if you had understood how this was going to change the entire economy around you, you would understand the size of the opportunity as that activity shifts, as everything moves. There's going to be a lot of demand that has to come on in a lot of parts of the economy if demand is going to come off in other spaces. And so when we talk to leadership teams at the moment, it's literally the number one thing they want to talk about. They'll be like, yep, cool, disclosures, I know, we can do it, we'll do that stuff. Talk to us about opportunity. Where should we be shopping? Where are we going? And so we've seen an explosion in interest on that side of it. And, one of the things that we do have a few conversations around the traps where people will say, we're starting to think about opportunity. I talk to investors a lot. A lot of the old stuff, or the old school industries that are sort of not part of the transition in the same way, at least as far as we can tell, they seem really cheap right now. So it's hard for us to think about new opportunities. Shouldn't we just be there? And what we say in those situations is, the reason they're cheap is because other people are thinking about the opportunity before you are, and so you end up owning the long tail, right? So if you're not moving, the rest of the system is moving around you, and that's probably a slightly, maybe a slightly less positive spin on all of that. But we can see it from when people move. They often call us. They say, "How do we think about where this opportunity is?" And so we see the scale of that movement, and it really is really marked and quite incredible at the moment.
We've had some interesting questions on the chat, so I might bring some of that in as well. So one question that's been asked is, what do you say to directors of companies in carbon-intensive industries who are aware of climate change, but trying to manage this financial viability and maybe perhaps are struggling to see the medium or longer term growth prospects?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll have a quick start at that. Of course, for a country with such fossil fuel dependency and companies that have done so well out of that and have been the great mainstay of the economy, that is one of the big questions for directors on those companies that have to make a transition. But they are in the business of transitioning. We know a lot of investors are looking for signals from those directors and from those companies that you understand that transition is on. It doesn't mean you have to be out of everything right now, but there has got to be a believable, sustainable pathway to transition that is about not just the climate risk, but it's also about stranded assets and actually ending up in a far worse position financially for investors, for stakeholders, by not acting. So in a way, you can't decouple this as future climate risk and current financial risk. They're all bundled up together, and they're the questions that investors are asking about whether they believe that you have a plan to transition. It may mean that you're moving into a new industry. It may mean that you are the leader in how that industry looks as it decarbonises. But we are on that transition of decarbonising, and it is tough in this country because of the fossil fuel dependencies, but it actually drives innovation. And the thing I've always thought about, if you actually put the price on the emissions or on the pollution, the thing that's causing the greatest problem, once you put a price on it and acknowledge that you need to remove it, you are fast running into the innovation space, and you want to actually remove that cost and that risk. And so I think it can be done. But Zoe, you know this from as an investor, when you look at when those don't move, what that will mean in terms of their risk.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was as part of COP, there's been a million words published, it feels like. One of the sort of papers that got potentially lost in the mix a few days ago came out in Nature Energy and said that, on the updated targets, something like half of all fossil fuel assets will be stranded by 2036. And so the question, if you're in one of those businesses, is how do you end up in the not stranded half? And to Sam's point, you don't need to change what you do overnight, but you do need to evidence to capital markets that you do have a path and that you're not in the half that strands. And what I would say with that is, talk to your stakeholders, be open, seek opportunity, because we've seen situations where entities that you would think are really fossil fuel, that you might discount and say, they don't have a role in a transition, have engaged with their stakeholders, that includes their finances, and said, what can we do here? What can we make work? And have managed to stand up transitions, including transition financing, including getting the buy-in from your institutional investors that have put those companies on a path to be leaders in the systems that they're in. And I'm not just talking about large diversified mining companies that had lots of really tasty assets already. I'm also talking about pure play oil and gas companies that have really, really started to make a move here. So it's up to you whether or not you get to be in the half that doesn't strand. That's something you can act on now, but you have to set your own pathway.
And perhaps I can bring it to a question of just directors' duties in that regard, because the question was really about the duty of financial, taking care of the finances of the organisation today versus the future. It just might be worth reminding directors that Noel Hutley QC, who wrote the initial opinion on whether there was actually a director's duty, was quite clear in something that I think we're all going to be really aware of as directors in the kind of economy we're working in. And he did say it's likely to be only a matter of time before we see litigation against a director who has failed to perceive, disclose or take steps in relation to a foreseeable climate-related risk that can be demonstrated to have caused harm to a company, and then importantly, including perhaps reputational harm. And that reputational question, if you're saying the future will take care of itself and we'll stay making the money today, and others take the view that your company's reputation is now tarnished and someone is investing in you on the basis that they think you're going to transition and you're not, that's a liability. And I don't want to go back just to all of the risk and liability space, but we do have a positive duty to make sure that we are accountable in a way that perhaps we don't often hear about the climate risk discussion and our duties as directors. And I'm now sometimes asked at AGMs directly as to, how do I acquit myself as a director who understands climate risk as a financial and reputational risk? And do I think my fellow directors on boards have a similar capacity? Which is, it gets very personal very quickly, but that's the direction in which shareholders and investors and the public more generally is taking to those of us that have that privilege to help manage these large organisations.
Thanks, Sam. And just on that director's duties point, I think it's important to point out that, absolutely, reputation and preserving reputation is part of that obligation to act in the best interests of the company. And also in terms of, is it financial interests or other interests? I think it's really important for directors to realise there is no obligation to maximise short-term profit. That is not what the law is in Australia. We are not like the United States in terms of how our laws are framed. So, directors need to be taking action which they think is in the best interest of the company, and that means taking a long-term view. And so an issue like this, it might not even be that it's necessarily a long-term view. It may actually be much closer than you think, particularly with that opportunity side of it. So I think that's important to frame that conversation. I just want to point out as well, David Thodey, who's the co-chair of the Climate Leaders Coalition, has put in the chat a link to that forum. So thank you for doing that, David. And as Sam mentioned, they're doing a lot of great work in this space.
Thank you, David, for doing that. I mean, one of the really important parts of that, of all the documents you'll find in the Climate Leaders Coalition webpage, is the questions that CEOs can ask. And I'd take that as a proxy for any question that directors can ask. And the categories range from energy transition, supply chains, offsets, resilience and capability, as you've said, Zoe, the financing, what does decarbonisation technology look like, and how do you collaborate to lead? There's a big piece of that coalition that understands that the great coalitions and collaborations that can come of this really make organisations much stronger. So thanks, David, for doing it. Thanks for your leadership with the coalition.
Thank you, Sam. So we've had a couple of questions around, how do we tailor this conversation for that SME audience, or I might even extend it to the not-for-profit audience, a lot of them whom are AICD members. what would be your advice to them? They're resource constrained, they're often relying on, particularly for not-for-profits, on volunteers, but they have a lot of goodwill. They want to do more in this space. What's your suggestion to get them moving, and what's the easy things to do in the short term, and then the things that will require more planning and more thought?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things to highlight is that, Sam's just outlined an incredible library of material that is accessible and that will get you a lot of the way up the curve to thinking about and engaging with this issue in a really material way. And I think sometimes we, you hear the volume of news on this and also the level of sort of political tension on it, and we think it must be really difficult, it must be really hard to approach. But it's climate change. A lot of people care about it. People put a lot of work into producing material that can help directors get up to speed without much resource at all. So it's not the sort of thing that you need to go and do a CFA on at all. You can do a bit of the CFA on ESG and climate change now if you want, but it is something that you can really access in a really direct and open way. And I'm sure, I mentioned before that there are a lot of people who are willing to help and support. And I think what's certainly happened particularly in the thought leadership not-for-profit space in Australia is there's a very clear understanding of exactly how important the commercial sector is, including SMEs, in this conversation. And so there's a willingness to be part of that conversation and a willingness to be accessible in all of this. And so I'd sort of say just, open the door, get involved, engage with some of the resources that Sam has highlighted, because they'll take you quite a long way.
I guess I just add two quick points. One is most SMEs have a relationship with a large organisation, either as a supplier, a partner, and of course, if you're a small organisation with constrained resources, this is the time to be talking to those that you're selling to or trading with, because if they have done the work, that's a great conversation to have and say, we're part of your supply chain, we need your support. And I would go to those organisations that have done a lot of the work and open up those conversations. So, but we know small business, it's hard to focus on everything, but nor is climate change not relevant to small business. So to understand where it sits for those businesses and where their risk sits about future customers, future issues that impact small businesses, whether it's just extreme temperatures, whether it's increasing costs of energy, whatever the topic is, it is going to hit small and medium enterprises as well. And then to the not-for-profit and kind of civil society world, or even just those organisations that are not like the ones that Zoe and I have been talking about, but in the health system, anyone that's involved in anything that uses energy, anything that involves exposure to the public and to health issues. We know that climate change is a huge issue for health administrators, for those running big operations where you have to think about what is the transition to a more carbon neutral way of operating, either for costs or reputational reasons. But this isn't limited to big corporates in the fossil fuel sector. This is pervasive. And so no matter where people sit in an economy, and if you're a director of a small not-for-profit, talking about climate change, what are the opportunities for us? Where do we sit in the continuum of this issue? And of course, as nature rockets up the chart as carbon has, so natural capital, nature-based solutions, those issues are going to affect a whole lot of organisations that whose board you might be sitting on. So exercise your curiosity, I guess. Keep asking the question as to where do we sit in this changing world, because our regulators have told us that we are sitting right in the middle of a massive transition, and the transition is economic, it's social, and it requires different kinds of conversations and collaborations. So, this is an issue that everyone, I guess, needs to engage with.
I would just really reinforce something Sam said there, which is that you engage with climate change in the way that it relates to you. Don't look at the way that a large fossil fuel company is engaging with it and go, that must be how people are meant to engage with climate change. A good friend who used to get asked a while ago on panels, what's the number one climate risk you'd identify? And she used to say, it's going to change the whole economy. When you get into it, it's going to change the whole economy. So I'm not going to flag for you just one big thing. And, I would really reinforce that in what Sam was saying there, which is that this affects everything. So find the way that it relates to you. Don't feel like you need to relate to it the way others relate to it. You don't. Find the way that it relates to you and your organisation. There probably will be a way, and you shouldn't feel constrained that by some sort of cookie cutter approach that's other people deal with these issues or think about these issues in this way. Find the way that it relates to your own organisation. If you use that gravity and if you take that approach, it's sort of, it can simplify things quite a bit.
Yeah.
Thank you. So a few questions I'd like to bring into the conversation. I should say as well, we're coming up to almost an hour of conversation. So I know people will start to leave. We've got an hour and a half allocated, but I'm very much keen to hear as many questions as possible. So if you do have questions, please pop them in the chat and we'll do our best to get to them. One of the questions I did have was, this question around a carbon price, right? Obviously been a hotly contested issue in Australia, but, we're seeing a number of jurisdictions overseas implementing a carbon price. There's been talks of border adjustments in the EU context. Got a question from David around, is the adoption of carbon trading a political issue or is it an economic question? Maybe one for you, Zoe, to kick us off.
Yeah, totally. So, as I said before, a lot of the time, we certainly in Australia often relate to climate change by thinking about carbon prices because we did once have a carbon price. And so many of those of you who, briefly, flash in the pan, those of you who were there at the time would have had to do all the prep, right? So we often think about carbon price, and we often think about it as being very political. But I think one of the things that's interesting about a carbon price, and this comes to the question of is it political or is it economic, is that at the moment we have an implied carbon price. The economy is already operating in a way that is putting a price on carbon. If we were to have you've all heard this argument.
Cost of capital, is that what you were getting at?
It's in everything. It's in cost in capital. It's in willingness to pay for products that are green or not green. It is in ability to get financing. It's starting to be evidenced through, as Sam was saying before, supply chain, so purchasing decisions. We are starting to run an implied cost of carbon across a lot of our commercial decision making already. A lot of organisations have shadow carbon prices that they run internally in their investment decision making. So, we've talked about a carbon price in the past as being this really clear piece of policy that allows us to make that all consistent and get it to be smooth, to get it to operate in a consistent way across the system. But in that sense, it's a policy, it's a political decision, but it's not something that it is one of those suites of policy changes that you don't necessarily, you're going to get it whether the government leads it or not, right? And so it's something that the economy is already acting on and something the economy is already starting to push into the system. I don't know if you want to add to that, Sam.
Sorry, just to jump in. So you're saying, Zoe, that it's inevitable that there will be a price on carbon in Australia at some point?
We'll end up with, what I'm saying is that we're already starting to see a price on carbon enacted through the commercial decisions that happen in the system itself. Whether or not we get a price on carbon, obviously it's been politically poisonous. They've had an extremely difficult time doing it. We will see where the political fortunes land and whether or not that becomes a different conversation in the near future. But a price on carbon, it's worth noting, is going to start to become something that a lot of our counterparties internationally do. And so it is something that we're going to wear in Australia and that we're going to experience throughout our commercial activities, even if we don't end up with a price on carbon here.
Thanks, so Sam.
Very much the same. And I think, look, it's a very practical matter. It has become hugely political, I think, for all the wrong reasons. And back in 2005, 2006, business came together with the Australian Business Roundtable on climate change and advocated for an effective price on carbon and an emissions trading system, which the then Prime Minister John Howard accepted and said, if you're telling me that business says that if you price something, it sends a signal to a market to behave in a particular way, in this case, we'll call it a pollutant or a driver of catastrophic risk. If you price it, we all behave in a particular way because you want to actually keep prices down. So you remove the thing that's costing you a lot of money. And unfortunately, by 2007, we were back to fighting about this as a moral challenge, and we lost that moment. But the Gillard government did have, for a short period, a trading system, and it's the only time we've really seen a decline in actual carbon emissions in the country. It works when you do it. If you can remove the politics and ideology, it's actually the simplest way to say we pay full freight for the damage we create. If we're trying to stop creating that damage and rapid decarbonising and setting scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions reductions for all the companies to have, there is inherently a cost of carbon being imputed. And then if you look at the markets that we want to trade into, those carbon adjustments, those border adjustments that are going to come from those countries that have got more aggressive targets are going to affect our exposed export markets. So they'll have to operate in a way to show why the carbon intensity has got to be lowered to actually be competitive on the world stage. So effectively, we're in that market right now. It's just a shame that we haven't been able to remove the ideology, remove that, and stop thinking of it as a tax, or it's actually a very efficient and effective way of focusing on innovation and what do you replace this pollutant with that actually helps us deal with the crisis of a climate problem that has huge costs in it. So if we do nothing, the cost compared to a cost of carbon is monumental.
Well, I was just going to add to that, like 2 points. The first is just directly follow what Sam was saying. We think of carbon pricing as this downside thing, as this tax thing. But the other thing carbon pricing does is it says, if you're a steel maker and you have got a low carbon way of producing steel, a carbon price supports you. If you've got a solution that you're going to provide into this economy and also into economies globally, a carbon price supports your efforts. And so at the moment, we're starting to find ourselves in a situation on this issue, on a bunch of other issues, where other national governments have put policy support or policy, not even support, infrastructure in place. And if you're a solutions provider in those markets, you're favoured by that. And if we don't have that, it means that our ability to stand up solutions commercially is hamstrung. One of the things we often hear from early stage startups that are, or even late stage startups who are doing, providing solutions in this space is, this would work if we had a carbon price. It would work anywhere else, but it would be easier here if we had a carbon price because it would stand up demand. And so it's not just a risk piece, it's part of your demand creation for the solutions that you're going to be selling in 10 years' time. But I want to make a broader point, which is that we often get asked, do you need government and do you need policy to do this? And I always say, if you have policy, it is smoother.
I'm getting this question as we speak. In the
Right.
chat, so.
Great. I would say, to that question, if you have government policy, then your transition becomes smoother, it becomes cheaper, it becomes less disruptive, and it becomes more inclusive. And a carbon price is an example of that. But a piece of policy infrastructure generally makes the whole thing easier. Without policy, you waste money, you lose investment. So we've heard a lot about capital flight in our national conversation in the last kind of month or so. So you start to become a high-risk jurisdiction, you lose investment, you strand assets, but you're still going to do it. We've seen a lot of action in the corporate space. We've seen this is a commercial conversation. We've seen a very strong willingness on behalf of Australian corporates to act on this. And they're getting better at it. A few days ago, Climate Action 100 Plus announced a collaboration with Rio Tinto, BHP, Glencore, Anglo and South32. That's a chunk of the largest chunk of the world's mining industry, to think about how you get to net zero in mining. So the private sector can get it done, but it is cheaper, smoother, more inclusive and less disruptive if you do it with a policy mechanism.
I think I'll just add to that. I think business can lead, communities can lead, but ultimately, if the guardrails are not in place and there's not certainty, then we find markets where that is the case. And back to the capital story, if we want to do things well in this country and really explore how innovative we are a very smart country. We have got so many of the levers of this transition at our disposal, but they do need guardrails and certainty, policy certainty, for people to actually commit the capital and not leave it up to the industry itself to sort of hope that that's the case. So the smoothing of it is incredibly important. And I saw that Fiona Rowland from Macquarie has asked some questions about what's how do we feel? Do we feel optimistic at the moment? And
I think she might have asked one about reporting.
And about reporting as well. So I think Macquarie is a great example because Macquarie's business model, I think, and the leaning into this globally is extraordinary. Just to see, again, an Australian company, Australian formed, out on the world stage in the markets of the green economy and the low carbon economy, tells us a story about what can happen when we get those settings right, and when there's a lot of optimism and enthusiasm for this phase we're in. But the reporting, I think, is an interesting question. So I think the question asked was, is it TCFD? There are many forms of reporting. I think more and more we're seeing organisations relying on the science-based targets initiative and being able to rely on a globally reliable standard to set your targets against and say you're happy to be checked against those science-based targets. There's a lot written on that. There's a lot, you can find lots of details about the science-based targets. Many organisations are using those to make statements. On the flip side, if you don't get your statements and your ability to do this well, and you just make wild statements about we want to be carbon neutral or we're going to get to net zero with no backing, that's now a big issue that ASIC and APRA are looking into. And it's the equivalent of a financial statement, and investors. And if you can't back it up, and it doesn't have to be perfect, but you have to actually back up these big overarching targets with very specific things. And I mentioned the ones before about short, medium and long-term targets that are verifiable.
I was just going to add to that. I mean, one of the things that's happened at COP, and it's nice to kind of get this conversation to go across all the things that are happening at COP because there are so many things, is there's a new global sustainability standards board that has been stood up.
Yeah.
Anyone who has been doing sustainability or sustainable finance or has been on the receiving end of sustainable finance in the company space will know that there's this never-ending argument around what are we reporting and why and when and how is it consistent and all that stuff. And the purpose of this new standards board is to try and get some of those, Sam's noted a number of the global frameworks to get to a sort of central set of best practice for companies, which I know would be a huge relief for a lot of sustainability teams, for a lot of executives and for a lot of directors and for ESG analysts too, because it really is overwhelming how much information people are being asked to put up on this. I mean, I just want to come back to what Sam said on SBTI there. One of the things we'd really highlight in this is that, the latest IPCC reports, and that's the UN's climate change science body, are showing that net zero actually works. And what we think will happen as a consequence of that is that this request for targets, that is net zero targets and interim targets, will become the norm for all companies. When we talk to the capital markets, and we talk to the capital markets a lot, that is one of their favourite levers. There are lots of other levers that they can use, but being able to go to your investee entities and say, I need you to have a target and I need it to stand up against something really credible like the Science Based Targets Initiative. This is something that's increasingly appealing for investors, and as they start to stand up their targets, it will become something they ask from all companies. So, most people are reporting against the TCFD now. We need to think about, or directors need to think about, how do you translate that into something like the SBTI, which is a sharper version that talks about your target commitment.
And I just say, look, I know we all sit on boards where there are various committees and there's often a sustainability committee. Increasingly, what Zoe's talking about means that sustainability work goes heavily into the audit risk committee and into the main financials and the job of the board to think about crucially, not just as the sustainability report that has a hopeful ambition around all of the forms of sustainability, but particularly on these targets on net zero. So it amps up the role of our ability to understand this in an audit and risk and core business sense.
So I might just try to deal with a couple of the questions as well. So Zoe, you mentioned this standing up the International Sustainability Standards Board, which I think is a big development for the policy wonks out there. I think they'll be very pleased. And, I know from the investment community's perspective, they're looking for that consistency and comparability, which is very hard with all these different frameworks. So that's something which the AICD has supported, this consolidation, and obviously, we'll see if that crystallises as a prototype climate disclosure standard that's been released from COP as well. And we'll see whether or not that ends up flowing into the Australian market formally. And I guess that will be a question for the Commonwealth Government. But one part, we've touched on this issue of greenwashing. And the other side of it is, how do we make sure if you're a director that you're not engaging in greenwashing, let's say unwittingly, or preventing your organisation from doing so. So this raises that question of assurance. We're very sophisticated in terms of financial reporting, in terms of auditors being able to check the financials and make sure they're accurate to the extent they're able to do that, accessing the records of the company and speaking to people. But it's a different question for this climate-related reporting, and the maturity of reporting practices and assurance practices seems to be less. So, if you're sitting on a board, how would you approach that issue and that challenge of assurance?
So I might start with, I guess, the more formal question of directors' duties again, because the AICD has worked with the Business Council of Australia and ACCI and sought another opinion from Noel Hutley about the doing of meeting climate targets. And that opinion was released only in April of this year, and I think it's probably on the AICD website. But if not, you can easily find it. But that opinion said something very significant, which is that a company and directors can be found to have engaged in misleading and deceptive conduct if you're not very, very clear about how you've actually dealt with your net zero targets. And there's a requirement of you to actually formulate a way of putting that deeply within the requirements of your general reporting. But that greenwashing per se will be something that the big regulators will be looking at. So I'd say don't think of this. The greenwashing issue is not just your marketing departments or the product side. It's actually at the heart of any statements made by the business and by the CFO, the CEO, and then up to the board. But you might have a view of.
I would add to that. So I think someone at the first week of COP came up with this statement globally where they said, auditing is the future of COP. And it was a good point because, we've gone through this process where we've talked about what we needed to do, talked about what was a reasonable commitment, kind of got together about that. A lot of people have made commitments. And then the next 10 years are going to be about increasing those commitments, but also watching and thinking about, are those commitments real? How is that reporting real? How are those commitments being enacted? And so having sat in sustainable finance for the last little while and felt the load come on as the attention to climate change lifted in that market, I can just say that the auditors should be hiring because there's going to be a huge amount of effort that starts to move into the auditing space on this, both, and that's relevant both for the boards and the people who actually have to do it because it really is, there's quite a skill build needed there.
Yeah.
So maybe linking in to that question around targets, right? And this is where there is sometimes that greenwashing risk. So, there's a lot of discussion in Australia about 2050, but globally and for a lot of organisations here, as you said, who are more focused and willing to prioritise these issues, the question's around 2030 and those targets. So, Sam, what's your view about going around and actually setting a 2030 target, and what's the board's role in that?
Well, I guess back to our initial comments about the questions that boards can ask of their chief executives and the conversations you're having. If you're sitting with a 2050 target, given what we've learnt from COP, what we know of the pressure on the world if we don't sort the temperature issue in this decade, I guess the first question is just asking, why don't we have a 2030 target? When if we did, what would that look like? What's reasonable? And to this point about greenwashing, can we make verifiable statements about these shorter term targets, but not be frightened by it or think it's going to be difficult to do or to shy away from it? So that 2030 environment, this decade, is a critical decade, and we know from COP that leaving things to 2050 is catastrophic. And so that's why many governments have given much closer targets, but great businesses are using 2030 as a prompt for much more rapid change and engagement with the issue. So I guess it's just a question of getting comfortable with all the mechanisms we've been describing, that 2030, it is a decade to look at, but that's where the big changes are going to occur. And if you're thinking too long term, the miss of opportunity, I think is huge. So it takes a bit of guts, it takes a bit of fortitude around the board table, but to be very practical and real about in our sector, in our company, what does a 2030 target look like, and what is our transition path, and who do we need to engage with to do that well? So it's the quality of the conversation, it's high ambition, but I think 2030 will just be the target if we're going to meet the science.
It's interesting. We talk about boards and tenure, and it's not uncommon for a listed company director to be on a board for 9 years. So when you compare that to, say, a CEO's tenure, which is often around that 5, maybe 6 year mark, maybe the board has a special role to play in terms of taking that slightly longer view and making sure that it can actually be achieved even in their time on the board.
We're all humans around a board. There's a couple of questions about our level of optimism and confidence and the rest of it. And when you sit around boards dealing with this, you can get quite bleak and you can feel a bit negative, and yet that's our job. And I think at a human level, I often think about the Sustainable Development Goals. It's the reason I wear the SDG badge. It's to remind me that these commitments were made into a 2030 timeframe around a whole variety of issues that business has been able to lead on, and many organisations, not just in public companies, have taken as key opportunities to show leadership. And I think of my daughter will be 30 in 2030. And I think you almost have to start making these very personal reflections on who are we preserving for? What are we trying to save here? This isn't a theoretical exercise. when we talk about carbon and net zero, it can often feel like it's outside the domain of how we're living our lives. But I want my daughter in 2030 not to have to be suffering from a climate and the consequences of that climate that we've let go because we thought 2050 was fine, because it's not. So I think sometimes personalising it, and I do bring along a prop because there are people in the world who think about this a lot, and Jonathan Porritt is he's one of the lead on the faculty of the Cambridge University program, but Jonathan wrote a book this year called Hope in Hell. I'm not spoofing the book, I get nothing back from this, but he talks about this decade and says you can only remain hopeful if you believe that in this decade we act appropriately and we make that big transition. And that's what I'm hopeful about, that we've got this moment to grasp. All the levers are there, the conditions are there. We don't need to wait for permission to do anything. We are the people that can do that, but we have to be quite intentional about it. But as you get to 2030 and haven't, we're talking about a different kind of world. And we'll see that ratcheting up going on, I think, at the various COPs.
Absolutely.
That we'll be catching up to.
Sorry?
I mean, I think Sam sort of encompass the ambition and the importance of that 2030 timeline and how central that's going to be to corporate planning over the next little while. I wanted to come at it from a sort of pragmatic direction, which is, we spend a lot of time with organisations trying to help them set 2030 targets. It's what we do day to day. And there's a few things I'd say about that. And the first is that, don't feel like you need to do an exercise of setting a 2030 target as this sort of terrifying, standing at 5,000 feet, got to kind of close my eyes and throw a dart at a board and hope that I can get there type of exercise. It's not that type of exercise. There is actually, that there's expertise that can help you do this from the bottom up in a way that feels doable, that feels comfortable, that's based on your assets, that's based on an understanding of how the system is moving around you. It may all seem a little overwhelming to have all of this, you can sort of pop in the news on any given day and there'll be some, outrageous forecast about what the electricity grid mix is going to look like in 2030, and you can read 15 of them. And it can feel like everything is sort of moving a bit too fast, and you do need to make these commitments without understanding all of that and feeling grounded in it, but you don't. You can actually, if you engage the right support, and also if you do the work internally and you build the capability internally, you really can access and reach 2030 targets that are accessible, that are grounded, that feel more comfortable, that feel realistic, and that feel like something you can represent to a capital markets without feeling like you're having to make a stretch.
And I mean, this has become a feature of our national regulators, our Treasury and our prudential regulators, who say quite clearly that this next decade we're managing the impact of climate change. So that is the physical risk that we know, and we experience it every day, whether it's bushfires or floods or temperature rise, whatever the issue is, we are having to account for that and think about a society that lives with the impact of an undealt with problem of climate change. But increasingly, those regulators and the Treasury is looking at the impact of an economic shock of leaving our transition period too late. So the earlier we act, and so, as you say, we're already late, but now is the time to start.
Yep.
But the longer you leave it, the greater the economic shock. And that transition shock is terrible for everybody. That's an economic set of consequences of delay. And so that's now recognised in our Treasury, it's recognised in our prudential regulators, that's why action matters, because the earlier you do this not so much smooth, but the smoother the ability to manage the risk that sits inherently in the climate and economic system.
I would add to that, Chris, there was a question earlier about, are you optimistic? How do you feel? Which is a great question. At the moment, we are, those of us who talk about climate change a lot, we talk about an orderly transition and a disorderly transition. An orderly transition is one where you get a carbon price, you get your stuff together, you all get on your skates, and you make your 2030 plans, and then you go through the next 10 years executing on those 2030 plans, and you've built the capability, you do it from the bottom up, you've got some policy guide rails. It's challenging, you have to spend money, but it's a doable exercise. Nobody gets stranded, no one gets left out. A disorderly transition is where you wait 5 years, maybe you wait 10 years, you have another couple of bushfires, you have a heat wave in India, it all gets very uncomfortable geopolitically. You start to have migrant issues in Asia Pacific, and then you will decide you need to do something about climate change post-haste in 2028. That's the one where you lose a lot of money and you also get to live with a lot of climate change.
Yeah.
So this is the disorderly transition that Sam's talking about here, and this is the one that we have to avoid. Now, to the question of are we hopeful, it is our view, we published a report on this last week, that we're currently sitting, we look like we're in the disorderly bucket.
Yeah.
And that means for the companies that we work for, with the investors that we work for, that there will be more stranding, there will be more impairments, it's going to be more volatile, there will be governments making policy at the last minute because they've realised they need to do it. That's what a disorderly world looks like. But the amount of ambition that we've seen at this COP is quite incredible. And if we can start to actually execute some of these commitments, then orderly is still in our reach. And orderly is very much, whether or not we're an orderly or not is not just a system question. It's also an individual organisation question. Are you going to choose an orderly path? Are you going to chart an orderly path for your own organisation? And I think when you're a director, that's the role, choose the orderly path.
That's it.
Thank you. Sam, I wanted to come to a slightly different aspect of all of this discussion. And obviously it's that question of the conversation in the boardroom and the question of composition, the question of diversity, question of how do you deal with people with strong views on this topic, either ends of the spectrum perhaps. What's your take on this?
So I think in the way we've described this is a complex topic. It covers so much territory, economic, social, scientific. It's about innovation. It's such a broad set, a sweeping set of topics, as are other topics that now face directors. So it wouldn't surprise anyone to know, as President of Chief Executive Women, we've looked at the issue of the more gender inclusive a board and a management team, the greater the capacity to deal with complex issues. It's not just because women are better at it, it's the actual total composition of a group of people who bring a different set of skills to bear on a conversation and on a big topic. We know from the 30% Club globally this week has issued a report on gender and climate change and shown that those companies that can handle and deal with inclusion and are gender respectful actually do much better on the climate debate. And there's something about that that women do bring a longer term vision sometimes and are up for these kind of conversations. But it's not limited to women, and I'd hate people to think that it's just about women. It is about having a really genuine engagement around the composition of any board and any management team. It needs to be diverse in order to handle complexity. And it doesn't matter which way you look at some of the assessments that have been made of companies that do that well, they perform better, and investors know that and have said that there is an uplift in return for those companies that handle these issues with a more diverse group of people at the helm. And that's why ESG, the social and governance piece, sits alongside the environmental and the climate change story. It's a whole package that we have got to be great stewards of our organisations. And you don't get to steward something if you're all from one part of a community or same background, because you don't really get to test and unpack these issues. So I guess it's just a plea for engagement with the idea that we need the right people around all our tables. And if there are organisations that don't have that, we know there are many in the ASX 300 and 500 that still have very monocultural boards and management teams that don't think this is important. Actually, it's a pathway to governing and leading better. So I think it's on all of us to do that. We've seen it in so many other complex issues that companies and organisations face. They're more enjoyable. I mean, there's certainly lots of great discussions. It has to be done respectfully. Great chairs know that and know how to bring competing interests together. And I think until boards do that really well, you need to then be bringing some of that insight as well. So I think having regular science briefings, having people coming and talking about, we've seen a couple of questions on nature and natural capital, that will be a core issue in the same way that carbon is. And to be able to understand that means bringing people in who can unpack what does biodiversity mean when we think about our organisation. So a big push for inclusive, diverse governance teams.
Can I add to that?
Sure.
It's also, Sam's flagging there at the end that inclusive and diverse also is about expertise, right? And so, one of the big things that came out of this IGCC governance boards report is that what's presently difficult in some of what visibly in the ASX is that there isn't the presence of the expertise on the boards in the way that you would like it to be, because you need someone who can help, who can support the conversation. It's not just that you've got one person who knows about climate change. Everyone needs to have a bit of commercial literacy on this. It's going to become something for everyone, but you do need that capability build and that diversity of expertise. The other thing I would say as the daughter of a mining engineer from Queensland is that it is also about meeting people where they're at. On this issue, sometimes people bring themselves to work, and that's great. And then also sometimes it leads to fantastic normative clashes on issues that are normative but don't have to just be normative. And so the other thing I would say is be ready to, when you've got a diverse team and you might have some diverse views on that team, having the circuit breakers, being ready to meet people where they're at and sort of understand that probably no one is trying to be a troll or no one is trying to be annoying, and being ready to sort of look into the eyes of the counterparty and try not to see eye to eye, but at least understand where they're coming from, is a really big and important part of not just communicating this, but also leading on this.
It's also, I mean, it can be quite thrilling. And some of the boards I'm on where the chief executive and the chair work together to build a program for the board or for the management team that brings in people who really are provocative but are subject matter experts, where you can safely have the conversation about and can test ideas and know that you're dealing with expertise. Because as you said, we don't need a climate scientist at the table as a member of the board, but we need a kind of curiosity and a capacity to understand the impact of these issues, as I said before, same as technology.
Climate literacy.
Climate literacy and kind of social literacy, around a lot of things that are changing. And to be prepared to then listen to experts and say, okay, I think we can adjust. And then you do need to manage it through the agenda and through the planning for the organisation. But sometimes it throws up things that just take your business in a very new direction. And I'll use Mirvac again, but we were looking at the kinds of things that would help build better low emission homes for people, because we know this matters to customers. So if you can connect with people who are giving you a clear sign that they want good products that actually deal with climate, suddenly you've got to go finding new supply chains. And that led us to the University of New South Wales and the work that's done on using recycled clothes to actually create fabric and walls and prefabricated parts of the building that are low cost. You can tell the consumer that this is actually all recycled clothing that's been turned into a building product. All of a sudden you're in a completely different world of the customer, supply chain, but you have to be curious and go out there and find those people. And in this case, it was about a degree of curiosity and not assuming the company knew it all itself.
I want to, we've only got a few minutes left, but there was a question up there which I think is a really good one, which is around the question of biodiversity. So a lot of discussion today is around carbon emissions, and rightly so, but I think this question of biodiversity is seen as a bit of the new frontier in ESG. What's your take, maybe, Zoe, to bring you in terms of how organisations should be thinking about that in that Australian context, and whether that's something investors are going to start pushing?
The answer is yes, absolutely. Investors are going to start pushing it. We talk about this a lot. One of the interesting things about having just done this on climate change, but also on gender, on modern slavery and a bunch of other issues, is that we have a template for biodiversity, both at a global policy level and also at a financial capital markets infrastructure level. And so many of you all know that the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, TNFD, it'll take us all a while to get it took a while to get TCFD down, it'll take us a while to get TNFD down, is being stood up and is sort of in the process of delivering their initial recommendations at the moment. And what that's going to mean is that biodiversity and this broader question of nature, natural capital, what is your natural resource use, how do you act as a steward of nature, is going to become a really central part of the competency set that organisations and boards and investors are going to need to have. And that's potentially difficult news to hear, because I know everyone has been running themselves ragged the last 5 years building their competency sets on a bunch of other issues. But at least I guess that we're accustomed to having new issues passed to us. But I would highlight the importance of that issue next to climate change, because when we were going into COP, there was a conversation that this is about net zero and climate positive. So it's being put nature positive, and it's being put at that level. It's being put alongside climate change as another key issue. So it is something that boards are really going to have to countenance, and leadership teams are going to have to countenance in the next 18 months.
And I think it's good to actually unpack what we're talking about with biodiversity or natural capital. These are the systems that underpin our ability to live. So these are our food systems, our soils, the things that we take for granted until suddenly a system collapses. Water, water constraints, pollination services. There are things that we just rely on that increasingly, from a nature capital point of view, teach us that unless you're prepared to protect them very well, you lose them. And what do you do in a world that loses water, loses pollination services, loses good soil?
Like Sydney in the summer of 2019-20, when a lot of us couldn't go outside and breathe.
And so that's what we're talking about. These are abilities to live, to prosper, to thrive. They just happen to be called biodiversity services, but they're just like the fact that we used up a whole lot of carbon to take advantage of cheap energy. We've been treating nature a bit the same, and so it is the frontier. there's much opportunity in it, but we need to skill ourselves on these issues as well if we're to be really protecting our organisations for the future.
Great, thank you. Well, we're really coming up to time now, so I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank the panellists. I think it's been a really rich discussion and we've really benefited from your insights, Zoe and Sam. I should say as well, you'll see some of this content as well in some of our channels going forward. We'll also have a video of it on our website. For those looking for more information from the AICD on the issue of climate change, just type in AICD and climate change. We're the host of the Climate Governance Initiative. As I said, we've recently released a climate risk guide with Minter Ellison in August. That's a great place to start for directors starting on their climate change journey. And as Sam and others have pointed out, there's lots of material out there, and we look forward to providing really that tailored resource and tailored communications for the director audience. So thank you again for making time for us. After this, there will be a short poll for those of you who are able to just rate the event, see whether you liked it or not. This is a trial for us, the first time we've done one of these kind of events via LinkedIn. I think it's been great so far from our perspective, and really appreciate everyone's engagements and everyone's questions. So with that, I might close and thank everyone again for their time. And thank you, Sam. Thank you, Zoe.
Thanks so much, Chris.